Good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to see you here tonight. My name is David Plylar. I'm with the music division, and I'm going to be doing a lecture tonight. But first, I'm happy to be able to start off with introducing our artist, Zlata Chochieva. And we're so excited to have you here, and it's been a long time coming. And I think that you're in for a real treat. And so I thought we could just talk for a few minutes before she has to get ready for the concert. And I'd love to just ask you about this program, because it is such a well-constructed one, and it's full of such interesting music. I'm wondering how you came up with it and how you developed it.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here. I'm very excited because tonight I'm going to play one of my most favorite programs. And this is interesting that actually that kind of program, so about fantasies, inspired me quite a long time ago when I was through some programs that Rachmaninoff himself played. And so that was the program that he used to play, and I sort of copied a little bit, but had my own version. He also played the Dante Sonata. I think he didn't play the Scriabin's Fantasy, but he did play Schumann, Fantasiestücke, and Beethoven, quasi una fantasia. And I think this is a beautiful chance to explore the freedom for music and for performing on stage, something which requires pretty much this kind of improvising mood, and also, as I said, sense of freedom. And I also put little pieces, very charming pieces, to start the program from Bartók, for example, Evening in the Village. It's very small, but I think it just gives this kind of improvising entrance. And I also put a little piece of Sibelius, which usually nobody knows, but it's very, very beautiful. And it just fits as a little prelude before starting the Scriabin, very dramatic fantasy. And I think it's a beautiful journey through different epochs, and I like to make it a little bit also in a freestyle, sort of starting with Bartók and then Beethoven and then Schumann and then again Bach. Bach-Liszt, basically, and then, so it's Scriabin and Liszt and even Sibelius. So it's really a journey through so many different languages, different styles. And so it's, for me, always very inspiring to play this program.
Do you have this sort of range across a lot of the programs that you do, or is this a unique sort of one, or do you often do all Rachmaninoff programs, or how do you usually program?
Well, for example, next season I'm going to play all the Chopin etudes, 27 etudes. I will start with London with Wigmore Hall. This was, I mean, I already played this complete etude program when I was a student, actually. And this was my graduation program. And I was completely crazy and would play 24 etudes without break. So now I'm a little bit less insane. So I put a break and start with the 3 posthumous etudes, and then 10, opus 10, and then intermission and 25th. So that, I think it's really, it's okay to take a break. It's not that necessary to put everything together. But I thought, well, it sounds good, but yeah, maybe. But I think it's a really great journey to play the Opus 10 together. I mean, all the 12 etudes and also the Opus 25. It really gives this kind of storytelling. I think he sort of kept this in mind, that this is a cycle. This is my opinion. But sometimes I do play sort of, the all Rachmaninoff program or all Scriabin, like 5 sonatas of Scriabin. That was my experience. But if you ask me, I like to mix different composers. I think it's a nice thing. I mean, both is okay. Also, to dive into a certain world of one composer is also quite an experience, I think.
Just a couple more questions for you. We had the opportunity this afternoon to take a look at some manuscripts and whatnot, and we looked at kind of a wide variety of things. And I'm wondering if there was anything that stuck out to you or surprised you with what you saw.
Well, that was really something I have to still, I think I won't sleep tonight because it was so really inspiring and such a special moment for me because coming from Europe, it's impossible to keep those manuscripts in your hands. It's just forbidden. Nobody allows this. You just can see them through the glass. And today I was able to hold in my hands the manuscripts of Mozart and Beethoven and Rachmaninoff. It's just crazy. I can't explain what I feel. And I was surprised, or maybe just super curious and inspired to see the sketches of Rachmaninoff for Corelli and Paganini Rhapsody. That was quite an experience, and then I decided to come back and maybe in a half a year or so, and just to spend a couple of days at least to explore this and study all these things. It's just really a big treasure for us, for musicians and music lovers.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it was. For me too. It's always the best day when I get to like pull stuff out and actually look at it myself too. So I know that experience. One last question. I just wanted to know what's next for you. What's kind of on the horizon for you in terms of any projects that are coming up, or recordings, or anything like that you're willing to divulge or tell us?
So it's nice for me to actually to take an opportunity and to say that I just got a confirmation from the orchestra to make a project this July. Still, we don't know when the release will take place, but probably in a year or so. But this July, I'm going to record with one of the biggest orchestras in Germany. It's Radio Orchestra of Berlin. The CD, which I call American Concertos. So it will be Amy Beach Concerto, an amazing masterpiece, which is still not well known, but I already played it once in Hamburg, and this was quite an experience. It's a 40 minutes piano concerto, which is a true masterpiece, and the audience was just blown away by this music. And the second concerto will be Samuel Barber concerto, which is one of my most favorite of 20th century piano concertos. It's really a remarkable, again, masterpiece. So I'm very, very excited.
Well, thank you. I think if we could all just give a round of applause for our performer, and thank you for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. I was really pleased that we had a chance to hear from Zlata. She's a phenomenal pianist. I think you're really in for a treat. She's not well known in the U.S., but I have a feeling that she will be increasingly. And so I feel that this is going to be a fun concert for you all tonight, and for me as well. So I always get excited about these concerts. All right, so I'm going to try to speed through things a little bit since I have a little bit less time. But the lecture title, I think, ties for my worst lecture title that I've had. But there's the final piece on the program is Après une lecture de Dante. And so it's after a reading of Dante with a DU instead of a DE, which was a idiosyncrasy of Liszt in that case. And in that one, it was a reference to Victor Hugo had a poem. But in this case, this is something about before this program gets started. So what we're really going to be talking about is the sonata fantasy and the different things, not so much getting into the woods with the how a sonata is constructed or how a fantasy is constructed, but rather to look at the building blocks that these different composers kind of put together to make things that we can hear and kind of explore things in an improvisatory sense. Improvisatory in that it's written out, so it's kind of this extemporaneous but still fixed in time sort of process that they went through. So the genesis really for this idea comes from Beethoven. So the Opus 27 sonatas, you'll probably know the Moonlight Sonata, which we heard Zlata Chochieva perform a couple weeks ago. That's Opus 27 number 2. What we're going to hear tonight is Opus 27 number 1, which is also one of the quasi una fantasia. So that means just like it's like a fantasy, or it's approaching the qualities of a fantasy, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And really, what I think you're going to listen, what I would recommend as a starting point for what you might listen for, is the juxtaposition of different ideas and the contrasts of different ideas, and so not just the music itself, but whether it's fast, whether it's loud, whether it's delicate, whether it's really strong. So the way that the first Opus 27 sonata starts, we can hear what that sounds like. You'll hear what I mean. So this comes on, and it's kind of varied over the course of a period of time, and you become very used to it. And then Beethoven decides to spice it up a bit. And sorry. Man. Wow, I'm failing on many levels here. But what he does is he then inserts this kind of crazy allegro fast passage right in the midst of this. So after you hear that kind of soft, peaceful music. So it's super fast and super, kind of energetic. And so you hear these things next to each other, and what you're going to find out, what you might realize, is that this is not a typical sonata movement, which has, like a first theme, a second theme, and then a development. That's in the exposition, then a development, and then a recapitulation, a return to that main theme, maybe with the key altered for the second theme, and so forth. That's what you would expect from a sonata. But what you're getting here is not that. So it's more, we're talking about ternary forms. So ternary forms are things just like ABA. So you have a main section, and then you have a contrasting section, and then you return to that main section, which is what Beethoven does. But then when you return, you're returning to this very soft, slow music, and then that ends, and you have this scherzo that comes into play. And here's what that beginning sounds like. So he likes to wake you up, like if you're just like he's waiting for you. You could just imagine him improvising and then getting a little side eye at the person who's nodding off. At least that's what I imagine is happening here. And then he has a contrasting second section, which is you might think of as a trio, but it's not labeled as such. So it's just a different, again, contrasting music. In this case, it's not slow. It's just a different kind of feel to it. We then move to, not sure what the concern is here, but we move to the third movement, and that one we're not going to have an example of, but for a good reason. The third movement is a slow allegro, the third movement has a slow section. I just realized I have it incorrectly in the program, but that's okay. But then the final movement becomes a sonata rondo, and this is where you have a return of a theme, and you have some elements of a development of like the other ideas, so that they start to do things together instead of just being repeated. So here's the first idea. So again, you have these kind of alternating things, and if you think of this as a continuous run instead of four movements, you might think of this as just like this sort of alternating fantasy, this nested sort of fantasy setup. So that's a contrasting but related material. And then we move to this is going to be a reminiscence of the third movement, which we haven't heard an example of, but this is what it sounds like. So it's a complete pullback from this frantic energy that's happening in there. So this is not maybe your standard sonata type of move where you're having this continuous development towards some sort of tonal goal. I mean, of course, Beethoven has those tonal goals too, but we don't need to go into them here. It's more just that contrast that's so unique. And then it has this wonderful coda. And so that's coming off of that slow music. And so now you have this compressed, almost like all the energy of the rest of the movement gets compressed into a final statement. And so then you can imagine it just going right into the Moonlight Sonata next. So, and again, continuing that alternation. And you see a similar sort of thing happening there, a little bit different, but similar. So now we're gonna move on from there to we're gonna go into the Fantasiestücke. These are fantasy pieces by Robert Schumann. But first, we're gonna talk. I'm just gonna show you a quick. I might have to skip these, but what we'll have is we'll open with a Bartók piece, a very short Bartók piece. But what's again the key thing and what's really amazing about the way that this program is put together is that this is simply an ABABA form. So again, it's that notion of coming back home to something that's familiar. The development is not, there is development in that there's like ornamentation that comes into play of the melody and stuff, and it gets more interesting like that. But it's you have a very kind of slow and sad sort of sounding material followed by this rustic kind of music on the bottom there. We'll skip it for now, just for time. But this is how the concert opens, and it's going to be kind of marvelous. The other one, again, this is on the second half. I just wanted to mention these. So these are, again, another character piece. So these are. This is from a set that's often called The Trees by Jan Sibelius, and it's the fifth one of the set of five. And this piece, again, has this contrasting element, but it has a extra musical programmatic component to it. Whereas, you don't have to think of it this way, but, you might think of it as wind blowing in the leaves and then a leaf falling down or something like that. You can, you may or may not agree with that. So you come up with whatever you like as to what you're hearing. But Sibelius has this remarkable melody that comes into play out of nowhere, and it feels like it should be, there's some type of film that I'm thinking of, but I can't quite pinpoint what it is, but maybe you'll have an idea. So it's really, and it's just a short piece, but he has this like mega melody there that he could have done a lot with if he wanted to, but he liked it in this short piece. And the other thing I'd like to say about it is that you can see that there's this 2 against 3, this sort of attention there that's getting built into these things, and this is coming from. I think that what we'll see in the Schumann and a few other things is this notion of imitative counterpoint that also was part of the fantasy from an early stage. And so I think that becomes a holdover that lasts even up till today. So we have a whole set of not the whole set of Opus 12, but we have two from Opus 111, which is not many people know this the set, but it's a wonderful set. And then we have Opus 12, which is sometimes said to be have an E.T.A. Hoffman origin in terms of his inspiration. But what I know about Schumann and actually a lot of composers is the inspiration for the work often comes after the work has been composed, and that may have happened in one case here, as we'll see. But this is again this interesting contrast here. We have this a piece called Warum, which means why, and why not? Why not? And But what's interesting about it from a musical standpoint is that you have this sort of a question-answer phrase that you usually have with whenever you're looking at a phrase in classical music, and in this case, the answer is kind of just more questions, as you can hear with the first example. So that's the first question. And it kind of just keeps asking the question over and over again, never really resolving. Of course, it does, but it resolves in a way that propels it forward. And then when we get to the end, it forces a resolution so that the answer is the question, in a sense. So again, I'm sorry to cut off right there, but there's now what's at play is not only the different parts of each of these character pieces, but how Chochieva has put them together into this collection. So we actually would hear Opus 111 number 1 first, and then we'd hear this, and then we move to Grillen, which is kind of like whims and fancies sort of a thing. And so you start to have a very different kind of feel to the music. Then you get to a piece called In der Nacht, and this is means in the night. And this is a piece of personal significance to me because my late aunt this was one of her favorite pieces, and so sometimes I would play it for her. And it's a beautiful piece, and but it's so full of angst, and there's a lot going on. So we'll hear just a bit of you can hear what is happening here at the beginning. So you can hear it's like this really restless kind of music. And what's interesting about it to me, beyond just I like this kind of music, is that the melodies and stuff start to kind of aggregate. They start to come together. So first you're hearing these little snippets, but then they start to become more and more whole as you go. And then when you get to the middle of it, it turns into this weird, swampy, strange world harmonically that I think was way ahead of its time and influenced things like the Opus 10 Ballades of Johannes Brahms when he heard this, and so the third and fourth ones of those in particular, I think were beholden to Schumann, and in particular In der Nacht. But the reason it says Hero and Leander is that this was, in your program you'll see that there's a quotation from Schumann where he talks about this piece being the story of Hero and Leander, and basically jumping into the ocean and being called back home by Hero. And the problem with this, of course, is that this is anticipating his own particular descent with his mental illness, where he jumped into the Rhine in 1854, I think, and then did the last few years at Endenich. So it was really kind of a sad foreshadowing of where he was headed. But he was poetic in that way. He noticed these sorts of things and they were meaningful to him in different ways. But I do think it was probably an after-the-fact sort of idea. Here's that transition point. So one of the things that I love about that is that it just sounds wrong, except, I mean, it sounds right. It's like wrong but right. And it's because it's anticipating the rightness by putting the wrong note first. So if that's an incredibly hard way to say that, but a dense way to say that. Sorry about that. Then we go to Traumas Viren, which is almost like dreams that are kind of all over the place. And so there's this sort of, it reminds me of Carnival at the beginning, and this is what that sounds like. You might find this in Carnival. But you have, in the middle of that, you have this one measure, this tiny measure that has a retard on it, so that you're supposed to slow down just for that, you're taking your breath in, and then you start up again. So it's this sort of a clown on a bicycle sort of atmosphere. But then that's contrasted again, just this idea of going back and forth with a ternary form. So with a very, like a chordal, almost hymn-like sort of central section. Then we get to, I think, one of the real gems of the set. And this is Des Abends. It's going to be like of the evening or in the evening. And to me, this is like a really good example of a suspension of time that's been purposefully crafted. And I say that because it's written in 2/8, as you can see there. And then you have each measure has 6 notes in it, so triplets going through. So you have, instead of 2 main beats, you're hearing 6 kind of attacks as it goes through. And so what this does is it starts to create, a sense of like a meter across different bars, so that it sounds larger than it just kind of floats above. It's not just tied down to the single measure. At least that's how I think that we hear it when the pianist is playing it and interpreting it this way. So it's, if you were to sit down and just try to play this and plunk it out, it would feel differently if you had it written, if it had been notated differently. That's what I'm trying to get at. But here's what that sounds like. You'll see what I mean, hopefully. So it's just kind of this floating material. And then when it comes back, there's also something that's really wonderful that happens. And this is I call it a quasi-canon, but it's more like it's an imitative material, where in this case it is literally a canon, but it's not a canon that finishes, and that's why I don't call it a canon. That's why I call it a quasi-canon. But it's basically the same idea is built into a lower register. But what's wonderful about this one is that it's off by 1/16, or rather a triplet 16th. So on that bottom example, you'll see that there's an embedded melody that's like a G flat with an eighth and an F, E flat, D. And so we'll hear it in the second half of this fragment. I mean, what a cool idea. I mean, that's the kind of thing that people in the 20th century would be doing more of. And so Schumann, to me, is just one of those really interesting composers ahead of his time, I think. So then our second half of the program is a monster half. It's incredible. But we're going to start with the Bach-Liszt Fantasian Fugue, BWV 542, the G minor one, and it's this one will be a little bit loud. So this is what it sounds like in the organ part. And so the idea here is that we have a fantasy. This is the Fantasia by Bach, and it has those same characteristics of going back and forth between these different ideas. Except in this case, one of the things that you'll hear when you listen to it is that you can imagine Bach improvising. He was a great improviser, as was Beethoven, and all these composers that we're talking about. And you can imagine him just kind of deciding on the chord at the last moment, because some of them are quite unusual in terms of the way that he manages them. But the problem that comes when you want to have an organ work for the piano is a very large one, because how do you emulate the sound of the king of instruments, the organ? So here's what this is the basic elements that you hear at the very beginning. Those are it says the manuals are up on the top, so those will be played by the hands, and then the pedal is going to be played by the feet, or 1 foot for those with just 1 foot. But the amazing thing about it is that you have to somehow structure this in a way that's going to make sense for the piano, where we don't have those pedal tones. So here's the organ part. So here's how Liszt deals with it. And so this is the final version of this transcription, which came about 20 years after he had done the 6 of the organ preludes and fugues by Bach that were kind of hailed as some of the great transcriptions of Bach. This one became a monster transcription, but one of the things that I like to tell people about is how composers like Liszt and other great transcribers can turn the sounds that you hear into something that makes sense for their own instrument. And so he has two solutions that he pursues here. On the top, you'll see the 2 larger staves. That's the main text. And so what he does is he puts this offbeat chord that is there every time that there's a need to have a propulsive 30-second notes happening. And this is in the main text. And then in the alternative text, he activates it with a rolled octave in the bass, then the main chord on the beat, and then a continuation of the 30-second notes in the descending line that you see there with the treble clef there. On the bottom line, the small one. So I'll give you an example of both of these. I believe she's going to play the second option tonight. But we'll see. You can tell me. So that's the option 1. That's the main text. So I like to think of this as like an insertion of another type of fantasy on top of the fantasy that's already there of Bach, because there's a lot of creativity that has to go into creating this convincing emulation of the organ. And I'll give you just a couple more examples. And this is what happens if you're able to do a pedal tone with your feet. So there's a G held there at the bottom. I know it doesn't have the clef, but it's a G. And we hear this at the beginning. So the problem is you have this held G and the piano doesn't sustain. You attack, you hit the note, and then it decays. The sound goes away, right? So what is Liszt going to do? We'll find out. But then there's also the other problem with the organ is that it can then kind of do these crescendos that happen just by holding down notes. So you'll hear at the end of this idea that I'm going to play next, the held notes in the right hand. How do you make those sound across the, So So to make that sustain over and then have a resolution on that chord is a tricky thing. So it's not a question of just transferring over. Oh, you just play it on the piano. That's no big deal. Unfortunately, it's not that easy. So here's just one example of what I showed you before. Liszt gave two examples, two ways to go about it. One was what's called an oscilla, or alternative pathway that you can take. Here, Liszt does not allow you to take another alternative, unless you decide to ignore what he's written. But what we have is that the main line that you hear in the organ is just the top line, and then he adds the bottom stuff, and this helps to build up from that G, and eventually he has things like trills on the G and other ways of kind of amassing sound. But this is just to give you a sense of one of the ways that he deals with this type of problem. So the idea is you're taking things that Bach might have done, or at least the sounds that Bach might have done, at least with the melodic components, and then kind of infusing those into the sound of the piano so that it doesn't sound foreign to the work. So it doesn't sound like you're just adding on this weird thing. And of course, you're using the sustain pedal, which is the one that kind of holds the sound, keeps the sound going quite liberally. Okay, and then we move on to the Scriabin. We'll actually hear the Sibelius next, but then we'll have Scriabin, and he's a really interesting case study here because he was interested in the sonata fantasy from a young age. In 1886, he had a piece that was unpublished until after his death, and this is just to give you a sense of the type of music that he was writing at that time. So this is still in sort of the Chopin phase of Scriabin's output, where he's emulating Chopin and his work, but it also is very distinctively Scriabin, and that often comes from the different types of chords that he uses and the way that he treats melodies. But here's, like, for instance, it sounds almost like Schubert, if Schubert lived 100 years later in the second theme. So again, he was interested in this idea of creating a larger structure where he could maybe deviate from sonata norms by calling it a fantasy. And so this is, again, Scriabin is known for his published 10 sonatas, many of which are one movement long. And then we have the Fantasy, which is situated, I think, just after the third sonata was composed. So this is in 1900. And this piece is quite something because you have these two alternating themes, one of which is, I think, one of his most beautiful themes. But it gets incredibly thick very quickly. And so you'll hear, when you hear the pianist play this tonight, just notice how many lines she keeps going at once. So in each register, there are voices that are continuing to go, and this is what makes, in many people's minds, this piece one of the hardest pieces in Scriabin's output. So that's, given the rest of it is difficult too. So, but here's what the first theme sounds like. resolutions kind of span many octaves. And then we have this secondary theme, and again, what you'll hear in this excerpt I'm giving is that idea of canon, this idea of imitative counterpoint comes back. So that's almost like he's playing a duet with himself. That's what I always think of with those types of passages in Scriabin. In fact, that's I think the main argument of this whole fantasy is that there's this element of a duet trying to resolve in some way. When the other thing, when the so-called recapitulation comes back, it's really more of a launching pad for more development, and so it's incredibly ornamented, heavily ornamented. And then kind of shoots away from there to just become even ever bigger. And much of this is kind of in the vein of his piano concerto that came out was written about 4 years prior to this. So the idea is that as we're starting to move towards the sonata, you'll find that instead of just being an idea juxtaposed with another idea that's different, you start to have that still, but then you also have development within those thematic structures. So there's a theme that's presented, and then that theme gets developed, but it's still positioned in a way that you can recognize it as a recurring idea. And so this is where we get into the Fantasia quasi sonata, which is the inversion of what Beethoven had said with Opus 27, and this is with the famous Dante sonata, so-called Dante sonata. This is the Opere une lecture de Dante. That's the final. It's the final piece in the Italy volume, the second year of the Année de Pèlerinage, the years of pilgrimage, which is just a wonderful set, of course. And so we'll start with I just want to show a couple of things about this piece and just to give you a sense of how Liszt develops things. So you will have, again, this idea of a theme that is presented or an idea that is presented, and that is developed as we go. And it's also kind of positioned in different ways, but they all have these different, they still maintain a certain integrity to themselves. And the other thing about them is that they start to transform into other themes, and I'll explore that in just a moment. But the key thing about this is the repeated notes that we hear right at the beginning, and the tritone, which is the devil in music, is what that is often called. I know historically, and so that it kind of makes sense that he did this, but it's also I think he has other reasons in terms of symmetry that he's going for. So here's the very beginning, and we hear those tritones and repeated notes. So that's gradually, we eventually get to this point where there's this amazing point where you hear that same idea, but now the tritones are gone, except it sounds like they're tritones, at least to me. So there's like these fourths and fifths that come into place. It's this amazing transformation. It's because of the harmonic context that he puts it in. And we'll hear just a bit of this. So that you hear that repeated note idea, and it's now descending. It was mostly fourths and fifths. I think that this didn't quite transfer over, but then by the time you get to the end, those repeated note things, instead of outlining tritones, they become indicators of finality with the chords. And so this is what you'll hear there. So you can hear how that the idea of the repeated note is not only transformed there, but it's also an integral part of the theme that precedes it, which actually will come into play in just a moment. We'll hear that. There's other things that I'll just give you a couple quick examples of motives that are presented in the introduction that serve as kind of a building block for other types of development as we go along. So here's just what that sounds like at the beginning. Near the beginning. And then here's a what happens to it as we get going through after the first theme is presented. So it's that thing in the bass that's it's really articulate. It's no longer this mysterious thing. It's this really forceful thing that's not changed itself in terms of its pitch content, but it's what it is it's changed its character. There it is again. And you can hear the things that we had been listening to before with those tritones and repeated notes now kind of mixed into it. So you start to have these things that he teaches you what to listen for as you're listening to this. And you kind of start to hear it in different ways as you get to more familiar with it. But I think one of the biggest points I want to make about this piece is the way that he develops through transformation. So this is the initial idea that comes in as the primary first theme. So one thing to note about that is that the cell phone thing that he inserted there was just really ahead of his time again, just like Schumann. But what's amazing there is that he actually has an indication to hold down the pedal, and so that you should be holding down the pedal during this whole murky process. And it's what it does is it creates this real sense of unnerving lack of clarity about where you're going and where you're going to end up. Then we hear the various transformations of this idea. So here comes a one. So notice that you're hearing that's just the same idea. It's descending half steps, so it's like a chromatic scale going down, and you have repeated notes. It's the same basic idea as what you have in the first part if you start on the B flat and go down, but it's got this completely transformed affect to it. I keep the original up there for reference, but the next one is that kind of comes in the context of another thematic development. So it becomes this sort of plaintive, almost like a wailing song in the midst there, in the middle of all those other things that are happening with the other registers. And then this transforms even more, but yet at the same time, it still has that descending idea at the very top. So this is what it sounds like. This one's a quiet one, so you could probably boost it. And so again, this is like that Schumann idea where you had that the isolated melody in the canon was off by a 16th note. You'll see that the same thing is happening here in that right hand. That top melody is just off of the downbeat. So it's not where you expect it if you're looking at it. So it feels like, again, there's something that's floating, but it's about to fall over, maybe, depending on the pianist's seatbelt or whatnot. But then we get to another remarkable transformation. And what's significant there is that now that chromatic scale has turned into a diatonic one. So we're hearing it in a tonal context now. And then we go back to that original one. And what I just want to point out is that it's super fast, so you're not going to just hear it. But the idea of repeated notes is still very much embedded into this idea in the right hand. But it's happening like this. So the right hand is moving quickly. So it's like moving towards, it's kind of moving you through these different spaces with the same music, but completely transformed again. And finally, here's another example of it, and this is one where, again, it's ingenious to me. The way that the repeated notes happen, they're displaced by octaves, and it sounds, it's very difficult to play. This is a piece I've played, and so this is one of those spots that's, I think, one of the more treacherous ones. So you still hear the repeated notes, but it's just in a slightly, it's because the hands are distributed differently. It has a different feel to it. And then what we find out is that this whole idea, that wasn't all of them, by the way. There's other transformations that happen. Liszt was just able to do this without, I think, really having to think about it. Obviously he did, but he just had a natural ability to do it. The kind of secondary theme that happens, that's this giant chordal idea. We get into F sharp major. There's some speculation that this could be a depiction of Lucifer, Lucifer meaning like the light bringer. And so it's a sense of pride or something that's happening at the fall, but mixed with something that's beautiful. And so the original, when you first hear this idea, it's very brash and very, you can see those giant octaves. So we'll hear what that sounds like. So I like to think of that as almost like more of like a pride theme that then gets different things happen to it. So here's, for instance, a transformation of that. So it's a transformation, but at the same time, it's actually the same basic notes that are happening, the same contour, the same actual note content, if you look at it closely. Then what starts to happen to this theme is that as it keeps going, it starts to elevate, move out of that realm where it was, in the midst of all those giant octaves and stuff like that. It starts to change. So here's one example of it trying to rise above this. So the left hand is actually playing above the right hand at that point, and the left hand is playing those chords. So it's kind of like, it's almost like this physical act of trying to get out from the depths in a sense. I think that Liszt was thinking about those types of things as well, but I could be wrong. But then by the end, you get this this sort of ethereal, heavenly sort of transformation of it. So I think the thing I just want to suggest to you is just that to have a really, to me, that listening to this program, having an open mind about how the pieces flow into each other, in addition to their internal content, really helps to elevate my understanding and my enjoyment of the works, because it's really interesting, for instance, to hear the Sibelius, which ends in a B minor, in the context of the B minor fantasy that kind of comes after it. It makes you, it just feels like this prelude to it in a way. So I just think that you're going to enjoy it, and this the type of improvisatory and extemporaneous thinking that the pianist has to do, I think really will come through in kind of making these attempts at fantasy within the context of like a more rigid context really come alive. So I think that she explores these tensions in a way that really kind of elevates the music as a whole. So thank you. I really appreciate your attention and stuff, and enjoy the show.